Okay, guys, hope you're all doing well. As you can see here, we're going to move on to a completely different topic today, and I'm going to teach you guys about different ways that we learn. All right, now you might see that term and think, "Oh God, here we go. Sounds incredibly boring because learning is attached with school. School is boring. Learning is going to be boring in Coach Klein's class." Well, we're going to talk about some much different ways that you have learned, you and I have learned, and many of these ways we've taken for granted, such as riding a bike, turning on and off a light switch, even when assuming, you can think back to being in class when the class bell rings, you guys just get up out of your desks and walk out of the classroom. Why? Because of these different ways that you have been taught, these different ways that you've learned. And I'm going to use that one as my best example for the day today is when the bell rings. Okay, it's a very Pavlovian response that you guys have learned since you were little kids, okay? And the first type of learning that we're going to focus on is called conditioning, okay? It's a very basic form of learning. It's when you acquire a behavior or a pattern of behaviors in the presence of a stimulus. So today's talk is going to be about classical conditioning. Classical conditioning, as it says here, is a behavior that's elicited from a neutral stimulus. That might sound confusing right now, but the longer I talk about this and we get through this video, it should make more and more sense. And let me make it very clear, we can always chat after this little lecture if you need some extra help identifying different parts of this type of learning known as classical conditioning. So when you think of classical conditioning, you got to think of this guy right here, Ivan Pavlov. Many of you guys have probably heard of Ivan Pavlov and the famous Pavlov dog experiment. Well, to try to tell you the story real quick, Ivan Pavlov is one of the most famous individuals in psychology, but he's not actually a psychologist. He's a physiologist. That means he would study the digestive processes in dogs. And he almost stumbled across this other phenomenon one day and ended up becoming one of the most famous people in psychology and not physiology. So, real quickly, Ivan Pavlov did research on dogs. He studied their digestion. Well, he lived above his lab. So every morning he'd walk downstairs to feed his dogs that he would be doing tests on. And he started to notice a very interesting phenomenon take place. He would notice that the dogs would get super excited right as he would walk into the lab. In fact, they would start drooling simply at the sight of Dr. Pavlov. There's no food in the room, there's no aroma, it's not present, the dogs can't see it, but they started to drool simply after looking at this man. He had a bushy white beard, and they were linking that man to, hey, he's the guy that usually gives us food in the morning, so they started to get really excited. Pavlov noticed this, and he wanted to see if he could make the dogs do a similar behavior, but to something different. Not him, not his, say, bushy white beard. And it became known as this Pavlov dog experiment. So here it is. And these terms aren't going to make sense just yet. Don't worry, I'll get to them in a minute. But here's what happened. So in the top left corner here, this is what's called before conditioning. These are called unconditional processes. If you give a dog food, it will, under all conditions, that's known as an unconditioned stimulus, it will salivate. An unconditioned stimulus is the food. It always makes a dog drool. That's called unconditioned. Well, next, Pavlov introduces a bell right before he prepares the food. So when he would ring that bell, the dogs would do nothing. And that's why we call it a neutral stimulus. It's neutral. It makes the dogs do nothing. So there's no response, no drooling. However, if Pavlov would ring the bell and then immediately prepare and present the food, the dog would still drool. But that's still an unconditioned response, remember, because the food is present. And if Pavlov would do this enough times, ring the bell, present the food, dog would drool. Ring the bell, present the food, dog would drool. Over and over and over, eventually, and this is what happened, one day he walked into his lab, he rang the bell, and boom, the dogs instantly started to salivate. No food. No food is around. That's what's called classical conditioning. That is now a conditioned stimulus. The bell is no longer neutral. The dogs have learned, hey, that's that noise that I usually hear right before the food comes, so I'm going to go ahead and start salivating now. That there, my friends, is what's known as classical conditioning. And here are the 4 elements that make it possible. I recommend that you guys pause this screen to get all of this information down. But we start with an unconditioned stimulus, which is the food. An unconditioned stimulus invariably prompts a reaction. What does that mean? Think of it as the word always. It's a stimulus that always makes someone do something. In this case, food always makes a dog drool. It's an unconditioned stimulus. Next, an unconditioned response is the salivation. It's the behavior that always follows the unconditioned stimulus. So every time a dog sees or smells food, it drools. Those are called unconditional stimuli and responses. No surprise there. These are things that happen naturally in our world every single day. But here comes the good stuff. Pavlov introduces what's known as a neutral stimulus, also a conditioned stimulus, which is the bell. He rings the bell that very first time, the dog does nothing. It's neutral. We call it a conditioned stimulus. But eventually we pair it with the US. We pair it with the food. That means we ring the bell, show the dog some food, the dog starts to salivate. You do that over and over and over. Eventually, if the dog starts to salivate simply after the bell and there's no food around, you have what's called a conditioned response. It's the behavior learned in response to the original neutral stimulus, the bell, which is now known as a conditioned stimulus. So there it is. There's classical conditioning. All right. That's the blueprints of it. Pause the screen, digest it if you need to, write these things down, and then move on when you're ready. If you want to see it a different way, some of you guys that are more mathematically inclined, take a look at this here. All right, number 1 says the US leads to the UR. Food always makes a dog drool. It's unconditioned. Unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. No surprise there. Step 2, you introduce a conditioned stimulus or neutral stimulus. That's the bell. Pair it with the food, the dog is going to drool, but we still have to call it an unconditioned response. Why? Because we're still using the food here. So the dog could be drooling because the food is still present. But if you repeat this several times, as it says here, which are known as trials in psychology, if you get the dog to drool simply after ringing the bell, if you ring the bell and the dog drools, it's now called a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. Okay? And that was the famous Pavlov dog experiment. And I'm going to give you lots of other examples of how this is happening in our world every day. Here's another example of it taking place with animals. I had a friend in college who clicker trained her cat. All right, and what that means is she could make the sound of a little clicker, kind of like the clicker I used to hold in class to advance a slide. It makes a little clicking noise. She could make the sound of a clicker, and it would make her cat run away. That wasn't always the case, though, because it was a neutral stimulus at first. So here's what we did. We'd go up to the cat, and we'd make the sound of a clicker. All right, and the cat did nothing. But right after we sounded the clicker, we squirt it with a little bit of water. The cat does not like water. It always runs away when it gets squirted with water. So that's the unconditioned stimulus. The squirt of water always makes the cat run away. But she would pair those two together over and over and over. All right. And after like 3 or 4 days, she calls me up. She says, hey, come back over, check this out. So I go over there. The cat is chewing on some toilet paper, something she didn't want the cat to do. So she goes over to the cat. She makes the sound of the clicker. Boom, it ran away. She had conditioned that cat to the sound of the clicker because the cat was assuming that squirt of water was coming soon. So she now trained it to respond to the clicker as opposed to soaking her cat all the time. All right. That is another example of classical conditioning with animals. I'm going to skip that little bullet point there and talk about some examples of it in humans, okay? Because that's who we are, obviously. What are some examples of it with us? Well, the first thing I want to share with you guys is if you have the opportunity to get on Netflix and watch The Office, watch season 3, episode 15, the opening scene of The Office, season 3, episode 15. They do a perfect example of classical conditioning. Give it a watch. It's beautifully done. I would show it in class if we were together. Watch it if you can. It will make you understand this even better. It's a little silly. Of course, because it's the office. Could it happen in real life? Yeah, it probably could with some time. All right. What you and I hear about more often, or we're around more often when it comes to classical conditioning, is humans and phobias. All right. Remember now, most phobias are objects or situations that come to be feared after we link it with something scary. So we're not born afraid of needles or born afraid of dogs. We have some scary stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, and then we link it with whatever hurt us or attacked us, and that's what we end up fearing. Okay, so here's an example of how, say, a kid might become afraid of the dentist. We're not afraid of the dentist at first. All right, we're taught when we're little that the dentist is a nice person who's going to clean our teeth and make our smiles better. Well, what happens if a kid goes to the dentist and that drill, all right, hits a nerve and it causes some pain or it causes a child to panic? That is very likely to happen. The drill is the unconditioned stimulus. The panic attack is the unconditioned response. Okay, but who is holding that drill? Our neutral stimulus, the dentist. So the dentist holding the drill leads to pain or a panic attack. And since we're a lot smarter than animals, we don't need to go to the dentist 15 times, all right, to become afraid. We could have just one bad experience with a stimulus and a phobia could start to set in. And that's how quickly a person could fear the dentist. Okay. Pause it again, digest it if you need to. I'm going to give you guys one other example. Let's see how well you can uh, identify the four elements of classical conditioning. It says here, people receiving chemotherapy often vomit during or shortly after the procedure. After several chemotherapy sessions, people begin feeling sick simply at the sight of the treatment room. Okay, let's talk about what our unconditioned stimulus is here. What is the stimulus that definitely made something happen? Well, in this case, it's the chemotherapy. Okay, the chemotherapy makes people do what invariably? The unconditioned response here would be vomit. Chemotherapy causes people to vomit. Okay, now after going to several sessions, we call them trials, the conditioned stimulus, all right, now becomes the site of the treatment room. The first few times someone goes to chemotherapy, the treatment room doesn't make them respond in any way whatsoever. That's why it's neutral. But after a few bad chemotherapy sessions of vomiting, simply the site of the treatment room causes a conditioned response, which is now feeling sick. So you can see here that the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are not exactly the same thing. Okay, people don't just walk into the waiting room and start throwing up, but they might get nauseous. So yes, the unconditioned response and the conditioned response might be the same sometimes. Other times they might be just a little bit different, okay? Kind of like if you get food poisoning from a restaurant, okay, and then 2 weeks later you see a commercial for that restaurant on TV, you're not just going to throw up, all right? You might start to feel nauseous. You are conditioned, all right, because of that first really bad experience with, say, Chick-fil-A, okay, or whatever. Okay, I hope this makes sense for everyone. What I'm going to have you do is take a look in on campus and do a bunch of examples just like this right here. Okay, so you're going to see an example. I try to make them as real world as possible, and you'll see four spaces. All right, for the four elements of classical conditioning, and give it a try. Okay. If you don't understand these, by all means, contact me, email me. Let's have a Microsoft Teams chat, and I'll walk you through it because I don't want you guys to miss these. I want you to get them correct. If you can understand these, you're gonna smooth sail, all right, for the rest of this chapter because this is the tougher of the types of learning, I think. But if you're getting a handle of it already, I think you're gonna do just fine. Okay, so good luck with um, this exercise and on campus, and I'll see you guys soon.